All right, welcome and thank you for attending our webinar today. My name is Ashley Limbers and I'm the marketing lead here at Solutions. At Encompass Solutions, we partner with organizations like yours to help simplify business processes and maximize their ROI with ERP solutions that connect their operations and reduce time-consuming workarounds, streamlining every part of the business. Today, we are discussing crucial updates in 2024 this year, changes. Just a few things before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded and a copy of the recording will be emailed to you. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel and we'll bring them up during our Q&A session at the end. Now, without further ado, we'll turn our time over to Courtney, the Senior CAM Enablement Manager at Avalara. Courtney, over to you.
Thanks, Ashley, and thanks everybody who was able to make it today. I'm really excited to be talking to you about the benefits of automating tax compliance, and thank you to Encompass for having this also. We have a great partnership with y'all, and we really appreciate it. So we'll go ahead and get started, and just so you know, if you didn't notice, this is being recorded, just like Ashley said, so if you need to revisit later on, you'll be able to do that. Okay, my name is Courtney Ingalls, and it might be a little bit confusing. Ashley just introduced me with my new title. I've actually, in the last week and a half, changed roles. So I'm actually coming back. I'm moonlighting as a strategic alliance manager, if you will, my old role. But I've been with Avalara for 6.5 years, and I started on the sales side. But for the past few years, I was managing the business relationships and the partnerships. One of those being Encompass, but the other being the Epicor direct relationship as well. So I worked with them alongside all of the channel partners, including Encompass, for about 3 years. I personally live in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I spend a lot of my free time outside, of course, at the beach here. And I'm really into cooking and studying nutrition and how that can help. So a little bit about me and my free time. Oh, and my dog Winston, you might see him in the background. He likes to do laps around the house, so hopefully he'll make a guest appearance today. All right, so on the agenda for today, we will be talking about the changing tax compliance environment. So particularly in 2024, anything that we're seeing that's new information to you, of course. We'll talk about Nexus and when you're obligated to collect Nexus. And it might surprise you a little bit, especially if you're on the call working with mostly exempt customers, which could be many of you. And we're going to highlight our exemption certificate management piece, which is also known as cert capture in the Epicor world. We'll talk about, of course, how you can streamline your tax compliance. And then we'll also, I believe, get a customer perspective. So we'll go ahead and get started. All right, before we get into the nitty-gritty of things, let's get some background on Avalara. So we are really excited. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. So we've been around for 20 years managing tax compliance. Our owners got their start in a garage on Bainbridge Island off of Seattle. So we now have 16 offices around the US, and our headquarters are still currently in Seattle, but we're actually relocating those to our Durham location. So if you're here in North Carolina, then we'll probably be right down the road from you. And I often am going to be going into that office as well. And that's actually where I got my start. And then during COVID, I was able to move to Wilmington, fun fact. But we have well over 4,800 employees at this point, and you can see some statistics here at the bottom. I won't read over all of those, but it just is there to show you how much we know tax compliance, especially over the past couple of years. All right, so everyone on the call today will likely be using Epicor. So we're going to be very Epicor focused on today's call. We do have over 1,200 different integrations. I think it's probably up to about 1,500 pre-built integrations at this point. But today we're going to be talking about our Epicor integration specifically because that caters to you as the audience. So in the Epicor world, we know Avatax as Tax Connect. So you'll hear me use those terms interchangeably. But here is some info on our tax compliance suite. This is not, we have a number of other solutions, but these are the ones that we feel cater best to our Epicor customers. So the exemption certificate management piece, which I mentioned earlier, we're going to do a deep dive into that later on in the presentation. Of course, what we're known for are the rules and the rates and the regulations that we can automate for you so that you're no longer having to maintain those tax tables yourself manually. Because as we know, that can be time consuming, and also it's very easy to make errors if you're doing that manually. It's tough to keep up with all of the changes. We actually do address validation as well. We can help with consumer use tax and the prep and filing of returns. So these are just some of the solutions that we'll talk about today. One of the ones that wasn't mentioned on that previous slide is our tax research piece. This came from one of our newest acquisitions, TTR. You might have been familiar with them before, but now it's known as ATR, Avalara Tax Research. So we're really excited to have this piece. Previously, we could really only answer the what of tax compliance, not the why. So this is sort of a database specifically for tax questions. If you are on the call today and you're finding yourself being a person who is having to look up the rules and the rates and all of that good stuff, exemption, is this item exempt, product taxability questions. If you're finding yourself going onto Google and going down that rabbit hole quite often, then this would be the perfect solution for you. A lot of manufacturers, I believe, work in sort of nuanced industries. So if you're breaking into new states, you might have questions about taxability. This would be great for you in that way. So think of it kind of like a Google for sales tax. You go in, you type in whatever question that you're looking for, and it'll pull up all the results that you need. And they're strictly tax related questions. And that way you know that the data is accurate and it's not something that you're just uncovering in Google. And one interesting fact about tax research is actually that a lot of the states are customers of ours with tax research. So that just goes to show if even the states don't know the answer to these questions and they're using tax research, then it's rest assured that you're not alone if you can't find those answers. And on top of that database, if you're not able to find the answer to your question, you'll have access round the clock to a group of people who are specialists and lawyers and people who work exclusively in the tax world, and they can address your question if you're not able to find it there. So this is a great piece that we're really excited about. Exemption certificate management, or cert capture as we know it. I'll use those terms interchangeably as well. In the Epicor world, we call it cert capture because it is a bit problematic calling it exemption certificate management when we know there's an ECM solution within Epicor as well. But I won't go too deep into this right now because we're going to highlight the solution later on. Just know it goes far beyond your average document management solution. This is specifically designed for exemption certificates, and it makes them far easier to maintain for yourself and also for your customers. So I would say if you have anywhere between 100 and 200 or more exemption certificates, it's worth looking into a solution like this. Then we have our tax determination piece, call it Tax Connect, call it Avatax. This is really the meat of our solution where we got our start. And in fact, we've really been known for this solution for so long that we spend a lot of time now trying to let people know that we also have other solutions. Of course, this one is a great one, but we do provide other solutions now on top of the rate calculation. So essentially the idea of Tax Connect or Avatax is we connect to your Epicor platform and or any other platforms that you're using, be it e-commerce or POS, anything else on top of that. And then all of the information goes in transactionally, and then the correct tax rate comes out. So in a matter of seconds, it will consider where you're selling from, where you're selling to, the product taxability of that item. If you're using exemption certificate management along with AvaTax, they can actually talk to each other. So it will pick up on if someone is exempt as well. So it'll do something that probably would take quite a bit of time manually. It'll cut that time down to just a matter of seconds. And then sales tax returns, this one sort of speaks for itself, but we can prep and file your returns. So if you're on the call today and you're someone who's been doing that manually, then you probably already know how painful that can be, especially if you're filing in many different areas. So know that we can also automate that process. And I will say each of these pieces, the first three, tax research, exemption, certificate management, and Tax Connect, can all be standalone. So you can buy these on their own. But if you're going to purchase returns, you're going to have to also have AvaTax as well to be able to calculate those returns. So if you only need to pick or choose any of those first three, you're welcome to do that. Okay, so the changing tax compliance environment, let's talk about that, especially in the upcoming year, what you can expect in 2024. So we don't often talk about income tax. We are a sales tax compliance company, but who knows? We dabble in everything. So maybe one day, but we did want to give you some updates on income tax. And one thing to note about income tax is that it doesn't have the same cut and dry sort of thresholds when it comes to establishing your economic nexus laws. So there are about 15 states out there that follow the guidelines for the MTC. And these guidelines tell you if you don't meet any of these criteria, then you likely don't have a substantial nexus within that given state. So $50,000 worth of property or payroll, $500,000 of sales, or 25% of its total property, payroll, or sales in the state. So if you're not meeting that, then you should be set. But that is just kind of a rule of thumb. So just look into that deeper. But they did want to include that information for you. The funny thing about economic nexus is it's defined as doing business in the state, but that can mean totally different things in each one of these states. So that's what makes taxation so difficult, is that every state is a little bit different. And then if you're selling into Ohio or Washington State, there's a couple state-specific updates here on the right for you. But obviously those are very specific, so needn't not pay attention to that if you're not working in those states. And especially if you're not selling newspaper printers or publishers in Washington. Okay, 5 years later, economic nexus is still a challenge. What do we mean by 5 years later? What happened 5 years ago? Well, if you've never been part of an Avalara presentation before, you might not have heard of the Wayfair decision. This is a Supreme Court decision that occurred 5 years ago. It was between the state of South Dakota and Wayfair, the company that we all know. They sell household items and furniture and things like that. They were doing business in South Dakota, and they didn't have a physical presence there, but they were doing so much economic activity there that South Dakota said, we're taking you to court. We believe that you should be collecting sales tax in our state. And the ultimate decision was in South Dakota's favor, which created a total domino effect for almost every state in the company, or in the country at this point. So they followed suit with South Dakota and have set thresholds. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on, what that entails. But there was a survey in 2023 that was taken, and 72% of people who took the survey find online sales tax laws complex and confusing. Who knew? But that is, 72% of people believe that. I agree with them. And then 40% of the folks that they surveyed say that economic nexus laws have actually increased the cost of their tax requirements and managing those. And then 72% have actually invested in the technology to help with the calculation. So something like Avalara or one of our competitors. But when it comes to Avalara and you're kind of looking into a tax compliance software, as an Epicor user, I do want to point out that Avalara is the only certified sales tax compliance solution by Epicor. Not only that, but we have an OEM agreement with them. They're one of our longest standing partners. So they have a special agreement with us that most of our other partners don't have, where they're actually the ones building the integration. So you can rest assured as the user that it's going to run as smoothly as possible because it's going to be integrated by Epicor. So that's just something to note that is not on the slide, but keep that in mind as you're looking into things, because none of our competitors are certified by Epicor. They only certified Avalara as a tax compliance provider. So I mentioned the thresholds. There are now 45 states out there that have set up a threshold with regard to economic nexus. So I will say before these economic nexus thresholds were established, there was the physical nexus, and that still stands. But now you take it a step further. Even if you don't have a physical presence in a given state, then just based on your economic activity alone, you could be required to collect there. And something that I do want to point out that's really important is, especially for those of you on the call today, regardless of whether your sales are taxable or non-taxable, there are a lot of states that say if you meet our threshold, even if every sale is non-taxable, you're still going to be required to register and collect there. That was not the case 5 years ago. So we're still finding it really important to educate our manufacturing and distribution customers on that information. So just know that if you're sitting here kind of tuning me out, that just pay attention to that part, because if you thought that this doesn't pertain to you just because your customers are exempt, that is definitely not the case. And we'll see a heat map in a few slides that will highlight that. And something to consider, particularly in 2024, there are actually 10 states that have dropped their transaction threshold. So they made it even easier to surpass their threshold and have to be required to collect sales tax there. Okay, so here's some information on the economic threshold state by state. Take this in for a moment. Each of these maps that I'm about to show you, I think the bottom line that you probably can deduce is that it's all very complicated, and that's what these maps really show. But ultimately, this particular slide, you see a few big states that have a $500,000 threshold, which obviously is a little more difficult to hit, and therefore hopefully you won't have to register and collect there unless business is booming, which is a good problem to have. But I will say that those few bright orange states tend to be some of the most complex states when it comes to taxation. So if you're selling there, you probably already know that. But most of the states on the map you can see are the light orange or the light blue. And those thresholds are either $100,000 in their state or 200 transactions. So it's fairly easy to hit those. And these are ever changing. So they can totally decide to change up their threshold. Next year, this map could look totally different. But as of right now, this is what we know. And South Dakota and Louisiana are some of the ones who most recently dropped their transaction threshold. Are you sitting on the call today just mind blown, wondering where on earth you might have Nexus? If you are, we have a sales tax risk assessment tool, which is an excellent tool for you to figure out where you have developed Nexus. And I believe it will actually tell you all different kinds of Nexus, because aside from physical Nexus and economic Nexus, there are other types of Nexus as well, just to make things a little bit harder for you. So I would definitely, if you're just kind of, maybe you did this a few years ago and you've grown your business a lot, come take that risk assessment again, and let's just see where you're at these days. It's a great conversation to have with a sales executive, even if you're not necessarily planning on buying right now. At least you can have that information and that idea in your head for the sales tax risk assessment. So if that is of interest to you, reach out to your Encompass account manager, and they can get you connected with a sales executive over here at Avalara to get that facilitated for you. Okay, so like I said, a lot of you on the call today might have many, if not all, exempt customers. And if that's the case, then all of the states in orange are still going to be states where if you surpass their threshold, you're going to have to register and collect there. It's a lot of states that still consider that part of their threshold. And then the purple states actually do include exempt sales, but exempt services are excluded. So yeah, that's quite a few that you have to consider, even if you do have majority of your customers as exempt. This one's even more confusing. I will just glaze over the surface of this one, but basically, if you're selling on a marketplace, taxation is something that you need to consider. All of the states are a little bit different when it comes to whether or not you collect or the marketplace collects on your behalf. So keep that in mind. I know it's becoming more and more common that people are starting to sell on different marketplaces. Oh, and we're going to talk about 1099. Just briefly want to mention that if you are someone who has contracted employees or any of your employees are on 1099s, we can actually help with that. So if you're needing assistance with your 1099s, definitely reach out to us. We're really excited. We kind of just revamped this solution, and it's that time of year where it needs to be done. So definitely reach out and we'll be happy to help if 1099 is something that concerns you. A few other updates. I'm not sure how many folks on the call today are selling software or digital products, but this is an area where it's been difficult to kind of define what that entails. So states are constantly redefining and figuring out the tax laws around digital products and services as they become more common in the world that we're in. So if that does apply to you, there are also conversations around our streamlined sales tax, our SST solution as well, to hopefully make that a little bit easier for you. But just know that there are varying taxabilities when it comes to software, depending on the state that you're selling into. For example, I know in Texas, when you're selling software, 80% is taxable and 20% is not, or might be vice versa. I think that's the way it is though. But it's just very interesting how different states define how they're going to tax software and digital products. And then on a personal level, I know probably a lot of us use streaming services. They're becoming more and more popular. So just know that you're likely going to have to pay sales tax on those services. And this is another area where they're still trying to figure out the taxability of the streaming services and things like that. So they're in courts figuring that out, and we'll see how it pans out for us as the users. This is not new. If you've been on any of our recent presentations, we are talking a lot about the impacts of the supply chain issues that we're still seeing waves of those effects, even a few years after COVID. So if you have any of these triggers below, if you're selling new products, you have new suppliers, if you're drop shipping, that's always a good indication that you could be triggering Nexus. And if you're doing more refunds, if you're selling a lot more on e-commerce, you probably have potentially more refunds that you have to do these days. So if any of those apply to you, it could have an impact on your tax obligations, and might be time to revisit the conversation with Avalara or some sort of tax compliance solution. Let's figure out if you have Nexus and when you're obligated to collect. So the definition of Nexus is, like I just said, really just your obligation to register and collect in a state based on your activity there, be it your physical presence, marketplace, obviously economic, and there's a couple other triggers as well. But it's basically you as a business, if you're needing to collect sales tax in that state, then you have triggered Nexus. Just to really simplify that term in case you were wondering, because I've talked about it nonstop so far. Okay, so how expensive, what is the risk and how expensive is it if you are choosing to kind of operate under the business as usual model and continue to do things manually? Well, you should know that that in most states, sales tax accounts for 40% of their state of their total state and local taxes. So that's a pretty big amount of money, and this is why states put so much of their time and effort and money into auditing. And that should actually say 45. There's now more, there are 45 states now that have economic nexus laws, as we saw in the previous slide. And this was really interesting to me that the average cost of an audit is $300,000. So if you're kind of looking at the price tag for Avalara, it's normally falling very far under $300,000. So we like to say you can either be proactive and put Avalara in place, or spend the money there, much less than $300,000 typically, or you can hold off and be reactive and pay $300,000 and potentially keep doing it incorrectly. So to me, it's kind of a no-brainer. But what's the actual cost of manual compliance? If you're a smaller business with less than 19 employees, it can be $12,000 a month. And if you're kind of a mid-size, it can be almost $18,000 a month just for, whatever you're paying your staff, or you're outsourcing to a CPA, that sort of thing. So that's very costly ultimately at the end of the year. And we never want to replace you as an employee or replace your employees. What we want to do, we always like to say, is allow them to go from working on non-revenue generating activities where you don't even get a pat on the back if you do it correctly, but if you do it incorrectly, you will, suffer the consequences, to working on revenue generating activities instead. So let's take their focus and their energy and place that where they can kind of help you to grow your business instead of just, scrambling around trying to get that tax right. So I've mentioned a couple of these several times. Obviously, really mention economic nexus a lot. This is the most common type of nexus that we see these days, but physical nexus is still out there. And then I also mentioned marketplace nexus, but click-through and affiliate nexus are a little bit more challenging. So I would just say, if you are trying to figure out what kind of nexus you have, if any, if you're selling into multiple states, it would behoove you to take that sales tax risk assessment as a starting point to see where you're obligated to collect. What are some activities that create nexus? Well, some of these may surprise you, and some of them might be obvious to you, but just to name a few that surprised me, trade shows could be triggering nexus. Obviously, drop shipments, we talk about that one a lot. But hosted data centers and licenses, royalties, fees, things like this, these are things that you don't think about every day that could be triggering nexus. And then there's some on here that are a little more obvious to us, but yeah, I find some of these very interesting that can possibly trigger nexus. And like it says, it's a growing list, so there could be other things that you might be doing that potentially are triggering nexus as well. Okay, let's take a mental break from all this information that I'm throwing at you. You just bought a forklift for your warehouse. Do you need to pay sales tax or not? Well, it's non-taxable if it's used in the manufacturing and production process to move raw materials. However, it's taxable if it's used in a warehouse to move around finished goods. So just a fun little nuance that exists out there when it comes to sales tax, especially pertaining to you as manufacturers. And is this something you really want to spend your time on? All right, we're going to talk about exemption certificate management, aka in Epicor world, we know it as cert capture. So I'm going to use those terms a little bit interchangeably, but just know that we will mostly be referring to it as cert capture in the Epicor world. But we did a massive rebranding internally. So internally, we know it as ECM. That's why everything kind of uses that verbiage on our presentations. So what did we do? We took our existing cert capture and really tried to analyze where we needed to make it better, basically. And that's what we did. So exemption certificate management is the next generation best-in-class solution for exemption certificates. And just making sure that you're compliant when it comes to exemption certificates. If you are still managing them the old school way in a filing cabinet, unfortunately, that's just not gonna cut it anymore. And I know that's not as common these days, but I do want to say that exemption certificates is one of the areas where auditors tend to hone in the most because they know that this is a very high dollar area. So you might have an exemption certificate that's worth quite a lot of money if it is filled out incorrectly, if it's expired, if you've misplaced it, then not only will you have to pay the cost of that exemption certificate, but also back taxes and penalties. So that's the reason that we feel managing the exemption certificates is so very important. Okay, let me get all these on the screen. I'm not going to go over one by one. But here are some of the benefits to using exemption certificate management. At the end of the day, it makes your life easier. It makes your customers' lives easier. But it has a lot of benefits to go along with that. So just know if you're someone on the call, like I said, who's managing a couple hundred or a few hundred exemption certificates or more, then why not look into something that can automate that solution for you? Not only can we manage the customer exemptions, but we can also manage the vendor exemptions, or both if you need that. So if you're wondering if this is applicable to you, obviously I don't think we have a lot of people who fall under government, nonprofit, schools, or churches today, but we might. But I probably do have a lot of folks on the call who are manufacturing, resale, that sort of thing. So if you find yourself in that bucket, you are probably a good candidate. And these are just some indicators that you might be a good candidate for exemption certificate management, cert capture. Yeah, those are some things that would make your ears perk up to see if you might have interest in something like this. So how are we different than, other document management solutions? Well, like I said, this is specific to exemption certificates. So we manage both incoming and outgoing. We support all of your sales channels. So something that we can do in many ways. If you are selling, if you're using multiple platforms, we can aggregate things into one place so that it's easily accessible if it needs to be. We can take, if you are one of those folks who is managing those on paper, we can actually digitize that. And that way it's always in the same place. So if so-and-so who manages the exemption certificates right now retires or goes on vacation and somebody needs access to that, you can find it within your cert capture database. So it's also automated with OCR. And you can also easily stay in touch with customers. So instead of having to reach out to your customers about exemption certificates, you can actually program it to do that for you in certain ways. So it really helps improve the customer experience for both you and your customer. Okay, mental break again. A distributor is building a new building. The items that are used to build that building are exempt, correct? Well, actually, if the building is a warehouse, then all of the items used to build the warehouse are taxable, unless you're in California and it's a special purpose building. So you're in luck in that way. If you are in California, it could be exempt for you. Oh, and something to know, California has the largest budget deficit in the country. But they just announced this exemption last July, so that was nice of them. All right, we're really excited to announce within the Epicor space that we can now manage international taxation with e-invoicing and live reporting. So this has been available for a while in our other spaces, but with Epicor, because of that OEM agreement where they're building out, we spent a lot of time to give you access to an international solution. So if anyone on the call today is selling into other countries, then we can help with e-invoicing, which is the exchange of e-invoices between suppliers and customers just happening right in real time. The same with live reporting. It's the reporting of tax and transactional data in real time. Most countries are starting to make this a requirement. The US, it will take a while for us to follow suit, but most other countries, particularly in the EU, are requiring e-invoicing at this point. So if you're selling into other countries, this is really important for you. We've seen over the past 10 years that many countries are being added when it comes to global digitization and the requirement of e-invoicing. And we suspect that this number will continue to grow. So we can certainly help with that when it comes to e-invoicing. If you've been waiting for that from us, then you're in luck. And I would recommend reaching out to your account manager at Encompass, and they can connect you with someone at Avalara to talk about what's available to you. Why is this important right at this moment? Well, like we just showed, a lot of countries are requiring this, and they will continue to add more countries to that list. So we're expecting mandatory e-invoicing to spread to even more countries than you saw in that previous slide. And if you don't have e-invoicing, your business could suffer if you're selling internationally. So you definitely want to have something in place that helps with that. You could be non-compliant if you're doing old school paper receipts instead of e-invoicing. So yeah, there's 45% of GDP in the EU that will be covered by e-invoicing by the end of this year, is what we suspect. And why is it something that you would use? Well, it's global, so you can use it in any country. We are adding countries as we go when it comes to Epicor, so it might not have all the countries available to you yet, but just know that eventually you will be able to access e-invoicing in all of the countries that we can help with on our other platforms. So we're just playing a little bit of catch up right now with Epicor. It's seamless and smooth. It makes the process a lot easier for you and your customers. It's a one-stop shop, we like to say, and then it's also scalable. So as you're starting to sell into other countries, we'll scale with you for e-invoicing. Oh, I guess I ended way before I thought. I did take out a lot of slides earlier today, so I guess that brings us to the Q&A period. I haven't been checking the Q&A box, so Ashley, let me know if you had anything.
Yeah. Perfect. Thanks. Thank you, Courtney. That was a lot of great information.
Yeah.
Like Courtney said, we'll go ahead and take time for questions. Just a reminder, please be sure to type those in your question box on the control panel. And it looks like we did have a question come through.
Okay.
And the question, Courtney, is, I am in manufacturing and we have a lot of customers exempt through resale. Does that mean we should collect tax regardless of tax exempt status? Sorry, I was a little confused.
I would say that it could still apply to you. So I would recommend having a conversation around that. I don't think that I'm not sure if they're very particular in states based on the status of their exemption. I think it's really just if your customers are exempt and you're in any of those orange states that we highlighted, there's a good chance that you would still have to require yourself to collect there. So I would just recommend having the conversation, maybe doing that sales tax risk assessment, and then checking to see, what the results of that are. And hopefully it won't be too overwhelming, but then you'll know. So that would be my recommendation.
Okay. And I think there's, thank you for that. I think there was a follow-up question. It was related to the map that you were showing about the Nexus threshold.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. I know that kind of, that is kind of scary to look at, especially if you weren't sure before about that nuance of there being the exempt customers included. So yeah, I would recommend reaching out to your Encompass account manager, and then we can get you connected with a sales executive to talk about the risk assessment tool and just gauge where you have Nexus obligations, and that will give you peace of mind.
Perfect. Yeah, and if they don't currently have, if we're not their account manager, like if they don't have one yet, if Lane Gemper is not, we can certainly still help. So please reach out and we'll follow up with you afterwards. Courtney, it doesn't look like we have any other questions coming through at this time. If we didn't get it to your question today, please email us and we'll make sure that we get an answer to your question from the Avalara team. Courtney, was there anything else that you wanted to cover before we go today?
No, I don't have contact info for you. So like I said, let's facilitate all the conversations through Encompass, and they're very familiar with us. We have a great partnership. So reach out to them and they'll connect you with us. But thank you for tuning in today. It's been fun, and I hope I didn't scare you too much.
Great. Thank you everyone for being here. Thanks again for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.